Tonight, we will tell you a story about a man whose name became synonymous with wisdom, yet who wrote nothing himself. His name was Socrates, and you will discover how a humble Athenian became a relentless questioner, how his pursuit of truth reshaped philosophy forever, and why his unwavering commitment to his principles led him to stand trial before his own city, facing accusations that could cost him his life. This is the tale of his nightly debates, the philosophical shadows he cast upon Athens, and the enduring legacy of a mind that refused to be silenced. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment with themes for future tales. Stories for Sleep are released here every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, let your shoulders drop, take a deep, slow breath, and feel your body sink into the quiet comfort around you. Our journey begins not with a grand battle or a royal decree, but in the bustling heart of ancient Athens, a city radiating with intellectual energy, where the focus of thought was about to shift from the vastness of the cosmos to the very core of human understanding. Today, I invite you to step back in time over 2.5 millennia ago to ancient Athens, a city that still shines brightly in the annals of human thought. Imagine a place where the sun warmed marble temples, where the sea air carried the scent of olive groves, and where the human mind was awakening to its fullest potential. This was the golden age of Athens, a period of unparalleled intellectual, artistic, and democratic flourishing, particularly in the 5th century BCE. Grand public buildings like the Parthenon, a magnificent temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, rose on the Acropolis, dominating the city skyline. Plays by great tragedians such as Sophocles and Euripides filled the open-air theaters, echoing with the voices of heroes and the dilemmas of gods and mortals. Citizens, not just a select few, actively participated in the governance of their city-state, debating laws and policies in the Agora, the bustling marketplace and heart of public life. Before this vibrant era, many thinkers, known as the pre-Socratics, had largely focused their inquiries on the natural world. These early philosophers, like Thales, who believed water was the primary substance, or Democritus, who proposed atoms, sought to understand the fundamental elements of the cosmos, the origins of the universe, and the immutable laws governing physical phenomena. They debated whether everything was made of a single element or a multitude, or if there were invisible particles constantly in motion. Their questions were vast, directed outwards towards the heavens, the stars, and the very ground beneath their feet. But as Athens matured, a subtle yet profound shift began to occur in its intellectual landscape. The focus started to turn inward, from the macrocosm of the universe to the microcosm of human existence. People began to ask not just, what is the world made of, but deeply personal and societal questions. What constitutes a good life? What is justice in a community? What is the true nature of virtue? How should we govern ourselves to ensure harmony and prosperity? This was a pivotal moment, a turning point, where philosophy began to grapple with the very essence of what it meant to be human, shifting from physics to ethics. It was into this vibrant, questioning atmosphere that a man named Socrates was born, around 470 BCE. He was unlike the grand orators or the aristocratic philosophers of his time. Socrates came from humble origins. His father, Socrates, was a stonemason or sculptor, a respected but not elite profession, and his mother, Phanerete, was a midwife. He himself pursued the craft of his father for a time, shaping stone with his hands, before dedicating his life entirely to the relentless pursuit of wisdom. You would not have recognized him as a great thinker by his appearance. He was known for his stout build, his prominent upturned nose, and his bulging eyes, often described as homely, even ugly, by Athenian standards of beauty. He wore simple, worn clothes, often going barefoot even in the cold, a stark contrast to the elegant attire and comfortable footwear of many prominent Athenians. He owned little and seemed to care even less for material possessions, living a life of deliberate simplicity, almost asceticism, which puzzled many. Socrates did not establish a formal school, nor did he write any books or treatises, leaving no written record of his own thoughts. Unlike the sophists, who were professional teachers of rhetoric and charged substantial fees for their lessons, claiming to impart wisdom and the art of persuasion, Socrates never accepted payment for his teachings. His classroom was the bustling marketplace, the Agora, filled with the murmurs of commerce and debate, the public squares, the gymnasia, anywhere where men gathered and ideas were exchanged. He engaged with anyone who would listen. Young aristocrats eager for intellectual stimulation, humble craftsmen taking a break from their work, ambitious politicians seeking counsel, curious poets, and even slaves. How did this man, who sought no fame and wrote no books, come to be known as the wisest in all of Greece? The answer lies in a pivotal moment, a divine pronouncement that set him on a unique, tragic path. It began with Chaerephon, one of Socrates' most fervent and devoted friends. Chaerephon, a man of impulsive nature and deep loyalty, held an unshakable faith in Socrates' unique wisdom. Driven by this conviction, he undertook a journey to the revered oracle of Delphi, a sanctuary dedicated to the god Apollo, nestled high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. This was a quest for divine validation. At Delphi, the oracle, known as the Pythia, sat on a tripod, inhaling vapors from a chasm, delivering pronouncements believed to be the words of Apollo himself. Chaerephon, with a mixture of reverence and boldness, approached the Pythia and posed a direct question. Is there any mortal man wiser than Socrates? The temple air, thick with incense and petitioners' whispers, seemed to hold its breath. The Pythia's response was immediate and unambiguous. No one. When Chaerephon returned to Athens and delivered this astounding news to Socrates, the philosopher was, by his own account, utterly bewildered. Socrates, with characteristic humility, genuinely believed he knew nothing of true importance. Accustomed to revealing others' ignorance, he never presumed superior knowledge. How could the god, through his oracle, declare him the wisest when he felt so acutely aware of his own lack of wisdom? This paradox became his life's true driving force. Socrates did not interpret the oracle's declaration as a personal boast or an invitation to arrogance. Instead, he saw it as a riddle, a divine challenge he felt compelled to solve. Believing Apollo could not lie, he sought a deeper truth within the pronouncement. To unravel this mystery, Socrates embarked on his lifelong mission, examining the wisdom of fellow Athenians, starting with those holding high reputations for knowledge. He first turned to politicians, men governing Athens, and considered epitomes of wisdom. Inspired but also puzzled by this prophecy, Socrates did not rest on his laurels. He took the words of the Delphic oracle not as a direct assertion of his superiority, but as a riddle that needed to be solved. If he, Socrates, was the wisest, yet he himself was aware of his own ignorance, then perhaps true wisdom lay precisely in that awareness. To test this hypothesis, he went into the city to test the wisdom of others, those whom the Athenians considered knowledgeable and influential. Thus began his famous conversations, which became the basis of what would later be called the Socratic method, or elenchus, a method of cross-examination. Socrates did not lecture or present ready-made truths. Instead, he would approach citizens, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and start a conversation with a seemingly innocent question about some concept. What is justice? What is virtue? What is beauty? What does it mean to be a good citizen? He chose those who were considered experts in their field or simply held strong convictions. Imagine the Agora, the central marketplace of Athens, teeming with life. Merchants selling their wares, philosophers arguing, and citizens discussing matters of state. Amid this noise and bustle, you could see Socrates, barefoot, often in a simple himation, a cloak not known for its luxury, approaching his next interlocutor. He would begin by pretending to be a simple man, thirsting for knowledge, confessing his own ignorance. He asked questions that seemed easy at first, but gradually, step by step, he would lead his conversation partner into a labyrinth of contradictions. His goal was not to humiliate or ridicule, but to help the person realize the limits of their own knowledge. He believed that only by admitting one's ignorance does a person become open to true learning. He showed that many who considered themselves wise were in fact merely repeating the opinions of others, or had an extremely vague idea of what they thought they understood. Gradually, one question led to another, and Socrates' interlocutor would come to the conclusion that their initial beliefs were mistaken or incomplete. This often led to a state of intellectual paralysis, where the person realized they did not know what they thought they knew. Socrates called this aporia, an impasse, a dead end in reasoning. And it was from this impasse, in his opinion, that the path to true wisdom began. Reactions to his method were extremely varied. Some young Athenians, especially those who sought truth and were not afraid of self-examination, were fascinated by his approach. They saw in him not just a teacher, but a guide to a deeper understanding of themselves and the world. These young men, many of whom belonged to noble families, followed Socrates closely, recording his conversations and absorbing his every word. For them, it was an intellectual adventure, liberating them from dogma and prejudice. However, for many others, especially those whose reputation and status were based on their supposed wisdom, Socratic dialogues were unbearable. Imagine a powerful politician accustomed to universal reverence, or a famous poet whose words were considered divine revelation. When Socrates, by asking his simple questions, exposed their ignorance in public, it caused not just irritation, but deep humiliation. They felt exposed, their pride wounded. Socrates seemed to strip them of their intellectual nakedness, and they could not forgive him for it. Some responded to his questions with silence, others with anger, and still others tried to joke their way out. But few could stand against his logic. Thus, Socrates, whether he intended to or not, began to make powerful enemies. His method, designed to purify minds and seek truth, became for many a source of personal offense. He was like a stinging gadfly that would not let the city sleep, constantly prodding it to think. He considered this his divine mission. But for those who preferred the tranquility of illusion, he became an increasingly dangerous figure, sowing doubt and undermining foundations. And this growing resentment, which had been accumulating for years, was bound to erupt. However, despite this, or perhaps because of it, Socrates attracted a very special circle of young people who craved not just knowledge, but genuine wisdom. They came to him not for ready-made answers, but for the ability to ask the right questions, for the path to self-knowledge. Unlike the sophists, wandering teachers of rhetoric who charged for their lessons and taught the art of persuasion, often regardless of the truth, Socrates offered his companionship freely. He did not lecture or create doctrines. He engaged everyone in a dialogue in which false notions and superficial beliefs were gradually dismantled, paving the way for a deeper understanding. His modest lifestyle, his lack of wealth and power, only emphasized the selflessness of his intellectual pursuits. Among those drawn to him were the brightest and most promising minds of Athens, many from noble families and destined for political careers. They were captivated by his relentless search for truth, his focus on ethical questions. What is virtue, justice, piety, and how should a person live? He did not tell them what to think, but taught them how to think, how to question their own beliefs, how to arrive at knowledge through rigorous self-examination. This process was often uncomfortable, even painful, as it required them to abandon long-held assumptions and admit their own ignorance. But it was this intellectual rigor that set him apart from all other teachers of the time. Two of his most significant students were Plato and Xenophon. Plato, a young man from an aristocratic family originally intended for a political career, was so captivated by Socrates that he dedicated his life to philosophy. It is through Plato's dialogues, where Socrates is the central figure, that we know most of his ideas today. Plato did not simply record his teacher's words, he developed them, building upon them his own grand philosophical system that would have a colossal influence on all of Western thought. Xenophon, another of his students, was a soldier and historian. His memorabilia of Socrates, though less philosophical, give us a valuable insight into the teacher's daily life and character, presenting him as a righteous and wise man whose advice was practical and useful. These two students, each in their own way, became the primary keepers and disseminators of the Socratic legacy. Remarkably, Socrates himself never wrote a single philosophical text. He believed that true knowledge could only be acquired through living dialogue, through the dynamic interplay of minds where ideas could be tested, refined, and truly understood. He distrusted the written word, considering it static and unable to answer questions or adapt to the individual needs of a student. He preferred to engage directly with each person, leading them to discover truths for themselves rather than simply absorbing information from a scroll. This unique approach meant that his entire philosophical activity existed only in conversations, in the minds of his students, and in the impact he had on their lives. Nevertheless, Despite his lack of written works, Socrates became a foundational figure for numerous philosophical schools that arose after his death. His emphasis on ethics and self-knowledge inspired Plato's Academy, a school dedicated to philosophical inquiry. His rejection of material goods and conventional wisdom influenced the Cynics, who advocated for a life of virtue in harmony with nature. His fortitude in the face of adversity and his focus on inner virtue laid the groundwork for the Stoics. Even Aristotle, though not his direct student, built upon the legacy passed down through Plato. Socrates, by his living example and his powerful method of questioning, initiated a profound shift in Greek philosophy, moving it from speculative cosmology to an intense examination of human conduct and the very nature of human existence. He taught that the unexamined life is not worth living, a concept that resonated deeply with those who sought genuine understanding. This growing circle of devoted followers, many of whom were destined for influential positions, also unwittingly contributed to the public perception of Socrates. While some saw a wise mentor, others regarded him with suspicion. His unconventional teaching methods, his nonconformity to traditional Athenian norms, and his penchant for exposing flaws in established wisdom meant he was increasingly seen as a disruptive force. His influence over the youth, particularly the sons of powerful families, became a matter of concern for those who feared social and political instability. The admiration of his students stood in stark contrast to the resentment of those he had publicly humiliated, creating a complex web of loyalty and animosity around him. This dual nature of his influence, profound inspiration for some, a potent irritant for others, set the stage for the trials that awaited him in a city struggling with its own internal conflicts and external pressures. His quiet nightly debates, often held in public spaces like the Agora, were casting long intellectual shadows that would eventually draw the full attention of the Athenian public. His unique approach, for all its appeal to inquiring minds, inevitably made Socrates many enemies. His constant meticulous questioning, though aimed at the pure pursuit of truth and wisdom, continually dismantled established norms and notions of knowledge, especially among those who held power and considered themselves indisputably wise. Athens, a city that had for centuries prided itself on its celebrated democracy and outstanding cultural achievements, was at that time experiencing a profound crisis. The Peloponnesian War, a long, bloody conflict against Sparta and its allies that had lasted nearly 3 decades, had just ended. This war had brought Athens a crushing and humiliating defeat, leaving the city economically ruined, politically unstable, and deeply demoralized. The once mighty and proud Athenian Empire had ceased to exist. Its once impregnable walls were destroyed, and its fleet was annihilated. Following this devastating defeat, Sparta imposed a new government on Athens, the oligarchy of the 30 tyrants. These were Athenian citizens, predominantly from the aristocracy, who had long openly opposed the radical democracy that had flourished in the city for decades. At the head of this group were Critias, a former associate of Socrates, and Charmides, also an acquaintance. These 30 men, having ruthlessly seized power, abolished all democratic institutions and established a true reign of terror unprecedented in Athens. They conducted mass purges of political opponents, mercilessly confiscated citizens' property and executed hundreds of people without any trial. Fear gripped the entire city, and even the simplest, freest expression of one's own opinion became an extremely dangerous act, capable of costing one's life. Socrates, despite his association with some of these men through their participation in his philosophical conversations, did not support their tyrannical rule and openly condemned their actions. He had always criticized both the extremes of democracy, when the mob made hasty and unjust decisions, and the extremes of oligarchy, when a few ruled by whim. He firmly believed that true justice lay solely in following virtuous principles and laws, not in the arbitrary application of force, by whomever it was wielded. There is a famous historical case where he resolutely refused to obey an order from the 30 to arrest Leon of Salamis, a wealthy man whom the tyrants intended to execute solely to confiscate his vast property. Socrates simply went home, preferring to risk his own life rather than participate in this blatant act of injustice. This quiet but firm act of disobedience starkly highlighted his unwavering commitment to his deep moral convictions. When democracy was finally restored, Athens, exhausted by years of war and internal strife, sought not only peace, but also scapegoats for its misfortunes. An atmosphere of tension hung in the air, a desire for stability and a return to tradition. A society that had endured civil war and the loss of independence was extremely sensitive to any sign of dissent or subversion of its foundations. It was during this period, as the city tried to heal its wounds and find new footing, that the figure of Socrates, with his uncomfortable questions and independent spirit, became an easy target. His influence on the youth, his constant criticism of accepted norms, and his seeming indifference to political turmoil, which had previously been perceived as eccentricity or harmless oddity, now began to cause deep alarm. Those who had suffered from the war or the brutal rule of the oligarchs were looking for someone who could symbolize the destruction of the old order, someone who could become a scapegoat for all the calamities that had befallen the city. And Socrates, who taught young people to doubt authority, to think critically, and to seek truth within themselves rather than accepting it on faith, became a convenient target for those who craved retribution and order. In the autumn of 399 BCE, as Athens was still recovering from its upheavals, a formal indictment was filed against Socrates, weighing heavily on the shoulders of the elderly philosopher. The initiator was Meletus, a young and ambitious poet who likely felt insulted by Socrates' sharp criticism of his craft and art. As Socrates often pointed out, the superficiality of many poetic works that, in his view, lacked true wisdom. He was joined by Anytus, an influential and respected democratic leader, a wealthy leather tanner, who was believed to harbor a personal animosity toward Socrates due to his harsh criticism of politicians and, perhaps, the philosopher's refusal to engage in active public life, considering it incompatible with the search for truth. Anytus might also have been offended that Socrates had openly criticized his son for not being properly educated and for choosing a path Socrates deemed unworthy. The third accuser was Lycon, an orator who represented the interests of professional orators and teachers of rhetoric, whose methods and income were often questioned by Socrates, who believed they sold only the appearance of knowledge, not true wisdom. The indictment was concise, but its wording was menacing and capable of provoking strong public anger, as it touched on the most sensitive chords of Athenian society. There were two main points to the indictment, but their consequences could be fatal. Socrates was accused of impiety, or asabeia, that is, of not recognizing the gods the city recognizes, and of introducing new deities, and also of corrupting the youth. Each of these charges had deep roots in Athenian society and was capable of undermining its foundations. The charge of impiety was particularly serious, as it could be punished by death. In Athens, religion was inseparable from the state, and refusing to recognize the city's gods could be seen not just as a personal belief, but as a betrayal of the community, a threat to its well-being and the protection of the deities. Socrates, as is known, often mentioned his daimonion, or inner voice, a divine sign that he said held him back from doing wrong and indicated what he should not do. This daimonion, which Socrates described as a personal and unique manifestation of the divine, could be interpreted by his accusers as a new deity that he, in their view, was trying to introduce instead of the traditional Olympian gods. For many Athenians, accustomed to public rituals, sacrifices, and worship of the pantheon, Socrates' personal internal connection with the divine likely seemed suspicious, dangerous, and even heretical. His constant questions about the nature of piety, the moral aspects of worship, and what was truly pleasing to the gods could be perceived not as a search for truth, but as an undermining of traditional faith and the authority of the priests. No less important was the fact that Socrates did not actively participate in the political and many religious rituals that were an integral part of every citizen's life. His detachment from public life, his focus on the inner questions of the soul and virtue, his seeming indifference to the outward manifestations of piety, all this could be interpreted as contempt for the gods and the city itself, which in the eyes of Athenians was tantamount to treason. The second charge, corrupting the youth, was no less vague but far more emotionally charged and insidious. Socrates attracted a multitude of young people, many of whom came from noble and influential Athenian families. Among his listeners were figures like Alcibiades, a brilliant but wayward general who defected to Athens' enemies and was implicated in the desecration of the Hermae, and Critias, one of the most brutal of the 30 tyrants, whose actions led to the execution of many Athenian citizens and inflicted deep wounds on the city. Although Socrates had always openly condemned their crimes and lawlessness and did not share their political views, their past association with him became a convenient and powerful argument for the accusers. They claimed that Socrates, through his questions, taught the youth not to respect their elders, to doubt laws and traditions, and to think for themselves, which, in their opinion, led to disobedience, neglect of parental guidance, and ultimately civil instability. At a time when Athens was striving for order and uniformity after decades of chaos, Socrates' free thinking, his calls for critical self-analysis and individual responsibility, seemed dangerous and subversive. His method, which taught not to accept on faith, but to subject everything to critical analysis, could be interpreted as incitement to rebellion against the established order, as a loosening of moral and social foundations that led to the emergence of figures like the tyrants, or to defeats in war. Thus, The charges against Socrates, though framed as religious and moral, actually had deep political roots and were dictated by fear and a thirst for control. Athens, having restored democracy, was vulnerable and suspicious, seeking solace in traditions and unity. They saw in Socrates not so much a criminal as a symbol of the intellectual ferment that, in their view, had led to chaos and defeat, to the decline of morals and the loss of former greatness. His trial became not just the trial of one man, but an attempt by the city to restore its identity, to purge itself of internal enemies, and to punish the one who seemed to embody everything that was wrong with the past years. It was an act of self-defense, an attempt to close the wounds of the past by sacrificing a man whose truth was too inconvenient for an anxious, recovering time. The city of Athens, still reeling from war and internal strife, found itself at a crossroads, eager to reassert its values. And so, the day of Socrates' trial arrived. It was not held in some secluded chamber, but in a large public court, likely the Heliaea, before a jury of 500 citizens, chosen by lot, a dikasterion, as they called it, reflecting the democratic ideals of Athens. The atmosphere was charged, a palpable mix of curiosity, animosity, and perhaps a quiet expectation. You might imagine the clatter of sandals on stone, the murmur of the crowd, the sunlight filtering into the open-air court, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Socrates stood before his accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, three men representing different facets of Athenian society: the poet, the politician, and the orator. They presented their charges, reiterating that he was impious, introducing new deities, and corrupting the city's youth. Typically, a defendant would appear in court with a mournful demeanor, perhaps bringing his weeping family, his wife Xanthippe, and his young sons, to elicit sympathy from the jury. He would beg for mercy, appeal to their emotions, and promise to change his ways. But Socrates did none of this. He stood erect, his gaze calm and unwavering, his voice clear and resonant, as if he were simply engaging in another one of his daily philosophical discussions in the Agora, the city's bustling marketplace. His defense, as recorded by his student Plato in a work famously known as the Apology, was not an apology in the modern sense of expressing regret. Instead, it was an eloquent and principled defense of his entire life's mission, a profound justification of his philosophical method and his commitment to truth. He refused to compromise his dignity or his principles, believing that a true philosopher must always speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. He made no attempt to flatter the jury, nor did he offer any emotional pleas. Instead, he presented a rational argument, challenging the very premises of the accusations against him. Socrates began by refuting the long-standing, informal accusations that had circulated about him for years, that he was a busybody, a sophist who made the weaker argument appear stronger, or one who studied things in the sky and below the earth. He clarified that he was not a natural philosopher, delving into the physical world, but rather a moral philosopher concerned with the human soul, with virtue, justice, and the good life. He explained his unique method, which he called the elenchus, a form of cooperative argumentative dialogue between individuals, based on asking and answering questions to stimulate critical thinking and to draw out ideas and underlying presumptions. He then addressed the core of the formal charges. Regarding the accusation of impiety and introducing new gods, Socrates explained his relationship with his daimonion, a divine inner voice or sign that would consistently warn him against doing certain things but never commanded him to do anything. He insisted that this was not a new deity, but rather a familiar form of divine guidance, a subtle intervention from the traditional gods of Athens, such as Apollo, whose oracle at Delphi had once declared him the wisest man. He argued that if he truly believed in this divine sign, it logically followed that he must believe in divine beings, thus refuting the charge of atheism. He stated that he honored the gods of the city in the traditional ways, performing sacrifices and participating in rituals. His philosophical questioning was not an act of disrespect towards the gods, but an attempt to understand their will and to live a life pleasing to them. As for the charge of corrupting the youth, Socrates argued that he never intentionally corrupted anyone. He pointed out that if he were truly corrupting the youth, they would eventually turn against him. Instead, many of his former students, now grown men, stood by him, ready to testify on his behalf. He explained that his conversations were open to anyone who wished to listen, and that he never charged a fee for his teaching, unlike the sophists, who were paid instructors of rhetoric and argumentation. His purpose, he claimed, was not to impart specific knowledge or doctrines, but to encourage individuals to examine their own beliefs, to question assumptions, and to seek virtue and wisdom. He likened himself to a gadfly, a stinging insect sent by the gods to awaken Athens, a noble but large and sluggish horse that needed to be roused into action. He believed that this constant questioning, this challenging of conventional wisdom, was essential for the health of the city and for the moral improvement of its citizens. He warned the jury that by condemning him, they would not be harming him, but rather harming themselves and the city by silencing a voice that served a divine purpose. Socrates acknowledged that his persistent questioning had indeed made him many enemies, particularly among those prominent citizens whose supposed wisdom he had exposed as ignorance. These powerful individuals, he suggested, were the true source of the animosity against him, manipulating the younger accusers. He declared that he would rather die than abandon his philosophical mission, for it was his duty, a sacred service to the gods and to Athens. He asserted that an unexamined life was not worth living for a human being, and that his mission was to persuade all Athenians, young and old, to care not for their bodies or their possessions, but for the improvement of their souls. He even suggested that his death would be a greater loss for Athens than for himself, as he was a unique gift from the gods, constantly urging the city towards virtue. He concluded his defense by reiterating his innocence of the charges and his unwavering commitment to his principles. He left the decision entirely in the hands of the jury, trusting in the justice of the laws, even if their judgment might be flawed. His apology was not merely a legal defense. It was a philosophical testament, a powerful articulation of his core beliefs and his unshakable integrity in the face of death. He was not afraid to die, he said, for he believed that no harm could come to a good man, either in life or after death. He preferred to be remembered as a man who lived and died by his principles, rather than compromising them for the sake of survival. His words, though seemingly simple, carried the weight of a lifetime dedicated to truth, resonating with a profound moral authority that few could ignore, even if they chose to condemn him. The air in the Athenian court, thick with the tension of the trial, hung very heavy as the moment of truth arrived. The 500 citizens, chosen by lot to serve as the jury, cast their votes. This was not a unanimous decision, far from it. When the ballots were counted, the verdict was clear, but by a surprisingly narrow margin. Socrates was found guilty. The vote for conviction outnumbered those for acquittal, yet it was a difference of only 60 votes. This close tally suggested a deep division within the jury itself, reflecting the complex and often contradictory feelings many Athenians harbored towards this unique philosopher. Some genuinely believed he was a danger to the state, seeing his questioning as subversive, while others, perhaps less convinced of his direct guilt, were nonetheless swayed by the accusations or the prevailing political climate, which craved stability after years of turmoil and war. The initial relief among his accusers was palpable, quickly followed by the expectation of a more conventional plea for mercy. According to Athenian legal custom, after a conviction, both the prosecution and the defendant were given the opportunity to propose a penalty. The jury would then choose between these two proposals. The accusers, led by Miletus, had already demanded the ultimate price: death. Now, it was Socrates' turn to propose his counter penalty, a moment many expected him to use for conciliation, perhaps suggesting exile or a substantial fine, options that would have certainly spared his life and allowed him to continue his philosophical pursuits elsewhere, albeit under different circumstances. But Socrates, true to his unwavering principles and his lifelong commitment to truth, chose a path that astonished and perhaps deeply infuriated many. He did not beg for mercy, nor did he offer a compromise that acknowledged guilt. Instead, he proposed a penalty that was, in its essence, a profound statement of his worth to the city, a demand for honor rather than punishment. He suggested that, rather than being punished, he should be honored with free meals at the Prytaneum, the public hall reserved for Olympic victors, heroes, and distinguished citizens who had brought great honor to Athens. His rationale was simple and utterly consistent with his life's work. He believed his constant questioning, his relentless pursuit of truth, and his efforts to awaken his fellow citizens to the importance of virtue were the greatest service he could offer the city. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a gadfly, a divinely appointed figure whose purpose was to sting the sluggish Athenian state into self-improvement, to provoke it into examining its own assumptions and values. To propose a mere fine, he argued, would imply that his life's work was a trivial matter, something he could simply pay off. He was a poor man. A large fine was impossible, and a small one would be meaningless, an insult to the grave charges against him. He adamantly refused to propose exile, for he believed his mission was tied intrinsically to Athens, and he could not simply abandon his purpose or find another city willing to tolerate his unique form of inquiry. His proposal was a final, unyielding affirmation of his belief in the supreme value of the examined life, an unshakable conviction that his actions, far from being harmful, were beneficial. This audacious counter-proposal, while intellectually consistent with his philosophy, proved to be his undoing in the practical realm of the court. The jury, already divided, was now faced with what many perceived as blatant arrogance, an overt disregard for the seriousness of their verdict and the authority of the court. Instead of the humility and contrition they might have expected, they heard defiance. Instead of a plea for leniency, they heard a demand for honor. Those who might have been inclined to vote for a lesser punishment, perhaps swayed by his age, his long life of service, or his reputation, were now alienated and even offended. Socrates had refused to play the conventional game of negotiation or show any sign of repentance, leaving the jury with a stark choice between the death penalty proposed by the prosecution and his own seemingly outrageous demand for public maintenance. The second vote, therefore, was far less close than the first. The shift was dramatic and decisive. Many jurors, feeling insulted or simply unwilling to concede to such an unconventional and unrepentant demand, now voted unequivocally for death. The initial 60-vote margin for conviction widened considerably into a crushing majority for the ultimate sentence. The decision was final. Socrates was condemned to die. The pronouncement of the death sentence, specifically by hemlock, a common, albeit grim method of execution for Athenian citizens, must have sent a profound chill through the courtroom. For Socrates' disciples and closest friends, it was a moment of profound shock and sorrow, a stark realization of the tragic inevitability that their beloved teacher's principled, unwavering stand had led him directly to this precipice. Yet, Socrates himself remained remarkably calm and composed. He faced his fate with the same serene composure he had displayed throughout the entire trial, embodying the very philosophy he had taught, that the fear of death is merely the fear of the unknown, and that a good man has nothing to fear in either life or death. His final words in the courtroom, as recorded by his most famous student Plato, reflected this tranquility, suggesting that perhaps death was a blessing, either a peaceful, dreamless sleep, or a journey to another realm where he could continue his philosophical inquiries with the greatest minds of the past. The outcome was a stark reminder of the fragile line between philosophical inquiry and political threat in a society grappling with its own identity and fears. His unwavering commitment to truth, even unto death, would forever elevate him from a mere defendant to a timeless martyr for intellectual freedom, whose legacy would only grow in the centuries to come. The execution, however, was not immediate. A sacred ship, dedicated to Apollo, had just departed for the island of Delos, an ancient and revered sanctuary where the god was said to have been born. According to Athenian law and tradition, no executions could take place in Athens until this ship returned, a period of reverence and purification. This provided Socrates with an unexpected reprieve, extending his life for approximately 30 days. He spent this time not in despair or lamentation, but in his customary manner, engaged in profound philosophical discourse with his devoted friends and students who gathered around him daily in his prison cell. The prison, a stark building with thick, cold stone walls, offered little comfort. Yet, within its confines, Socrates transformed it into a unique classroom. His voice, steady and clear, continued to explore the fundamental questions of life, virtue, and the soul. He spoke of the nature of death, not as an end to be feared, but as a journey, or perhaps a dreamless sleep, an unknown realm that held no terror, for one who had lived justly. His friends, though heartbroken by his impending fate, found themselves drawn into his arguments, captivated by his serene acceptance and the unwavering clarity of his thought. They sat on rough benches or on the floor, listening intently, sometimes interjecting with questions, sometimes simply absorbing the wisdom emanating from their teacher. The air in the cell, often damp and dim, was nevertheless filled with the light of reason and the warmth of genuine affection. Among his most loyal and frequent visitors was Crito, an old and wealthy friend, deeply devoted to Socrates. Crito could not reconcile himself to the injustice of the verdict or the impending loss of his beloved mentor. Driven by a desperate desire to save Socrates, he arrived one morning with a carefully conceived plan for escape. Crito entered the cell as dawn was breaking, the first pale light filtering through the small high window, revealing Socrates, still sleeping peacefully. Crito sat down quietly, watching his friend, marveling at his tranquility even in the face of death. When Socrates awoke, Crito immediately launched into his plea, his voice filled with urgency and emotion. "Socrates," Crito began, his brow furrowed with worry, "I have come to urge you for your own sake and for ours to escape. Everything is arranged. There are people in Thessaly, friends of mine, who will receive you and protect you. They are willing to pay for your safety, and I, along with your other friends, have more than enough wealth to cover any expenses or bribes necessary for your passage." Crito presented a series of compelling arguments. He explained that if Socrates remained and died, it would bring shame upon his friends. People would assume they had been too cowardly or too stingy to save him, despite having the means. This would tarnish their reputation and confirm the public's perception that they were not true friends. Furthermore, Crito argued that Socrates would be abandoning his children, leaving them fatherless and vulnerable. It was his duty, Crito insisted, to raise and educate them, not to forsake them. He also appealed to the perceived injustice of the verdict itself. "You are being condemned unjustly," Crito reasoned, "and to submit to injustice when you have the power to resist it is itself an act of injustice. You would be playing into the hands of your enemies who wish to harm you. Why should you allow them to succeed?" He urged Socrates not to choose the easier path of passive acceptance, but to stand up for himself and for justice, even if it meant breaking the law. The decision to remain, Crito implied, was not merely a personal choice, but a moral failing that would reflect poorly on Socrates' entire philosophical life. Socrates listened patiently, his gaze calm and unwavering, as Crito poured out his heart. When his friend had finished, Socrates acknowledged the sincerity and good intentions behind Crito's plea. He understood the love and concern that motivated him. However, Socrates immediately turned the discussion to his lifelong principles, the very foundations upon which his philosophy was built. He reminded Crito that their discussions had always been guided by reason, by the pursuit of what was truly good and just, regardless of popular opinion or personal consequence. "Should we listen to the opinion of the many," Socrates asked, "or only to the opinion of the one who knows, who is an expert in matters of right and wrong?" He argued that the most important thing was not merely to live, but to live well, to live justly, and to live honorably. Socrates then presented his powerful argument concerning the laws of Athens, personifying them as if they were speaking directly to him. He explained that by choosing to live in Athens his entire life, by raising his family there, and by never seeking exile, he had implicitly entered into a social contract with the city and its laws. He had enjoyed the protection and benefits that the Athenian legal system provided, the education, the security. He would be betraying this unspoken agreement. He would be demonstrating contempt for the very laws that had nurtured and sustained him. If we escape, Socrates reasoned, what shall we say to the laws? Shall we say that we are justified in destroying them because they have done us wrong? What state, what city can survive if its judgments have no force but are nullified and destroyed by private individuals? He contended that escaping would not only be a violation of his agreement with the laws, but would also set a dangerous precedent. It would encourage others to disregard the legal system whenever they disagreed with a verdict, leading to chaos and the collapse of the state. Furthermore, Socrates argued that escaping would confirm the accusations against him. If he fled, he would appear to be a lawbreaker, a corrupter of youth, and an enemy of the state, thus validating the very charges that had led to his condemnation. His flight would give credence to the idea that he held no respect for the institutions of Athens, undermining his entire philosophical mission to seek truth and foster virtue within the city. Would I then be acting justly, Socrates asked, to destroy the very laws that have made me who I am, to choose life at the cost of justice? Socrates emphasized that his concern was not for his body or his earthly existence, but for the well-being of his soul and the integrity of his principles. He had spent his life teaching that doing wrong in return for wrong was never justified, and that one should never harm another, even if harmed first. To escape now, he believed, would be to commit a great wrong against the state and against the very principles he had always upheld. It would be an act of hypocrisy, rendering his entire life's work meaningless. He was prepared to die for his convictions, demonstrating that truth and justice were worth more than life itself. His steadfast refusal was not a sign of resignation, but a powerful affirmation of his unwavering commitment to the principles of justice and the rule of law, even when those laws seemed to condemn him unfairly. Crito, though heartbroken, could not refute Socrates' powerful reasoning. The philosopher's arguments, rooted in logic and moral consistency, left no room for doubt. Socrates would remain. His decision was firm, rooted in the principles he taught. The sun rose on his execution day, a day that would alter the course of philosophy. In the Athenian prison, a quiet, somber atmosphere settled. His students and closest friends gathered, their faces etched with despair. They saw not a man facing death, but a philosopher living his beliefs. Socrates remained composed, his voice calm, his mind clear. He spoke of the soul, of death as a transition, offering solace. He reminded them, a good man suffers no harm neither in life nor death. As morning wore on, the Athenian magistrates in charge of the prison, sent their servant. The man, visibly distressed, instructed Socrates on the procedure. He explained that at sunset, the cup of hemlock, a potent plant-based poison, would be brought. Socrates listened patiently, showing no fear, only quiet acceptance. His friends, however, wept openly, their composure finally breaking.